Montana Territory, 1873. The sky above Promise Creek stretched vast and unforgiving as Thomas Sutherland squinted up at the gathering storm clouds. At 25, he had already seen enough of the West to know that nothing here was permanent. Not settlements, not friendships, and certainly not love. The cattle drive he'd joined would last 1 year, and that suited him just fine. 1 year of honest work, then he'd move on. That was the cowboy way. Nothing lasts out here, he muttered to himself as he adjusted the worn leather saddle on his chestnut stallion. Especially not people. Thomas had the kind of face that made young women in town turn their heads, strong jawline softened by youth, piercing blue eyes beneath a weathered hat, and light stubble that never quite grew into a proper beard. His shoulders were broad from years of ranch work, his frame lean but powerful. Yet despite his handsome features, he kept mostly to himself, convinced that forming attachments in this untamed land was a fool's gamble. The Rocking S Ranch had hired him and a dozen other men to drive 2,000 head of cattle to markets in Kansas. Good pay, hard work, and temporary. Exactly how Thomas preferred his arrangements. He had watched his own family's homestead burn during a raid when he was 16, his parents lost to the unforgiving frontier. Since then, he had drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying longer than a season. Sutherland, boss wants everyone at the main house before we head out tomorrow, called Hank, one of the older ranch hands. Thomas nodded and led his horse toward the sprawling ranch house that served as headquarters for the Rocking S. As he approached, he noticed an unfamiliar wagon parked outside, its contents half unloaded. Trunks and crates suggested someone had arrived to stay. "Who's that belong to?" he asked Hank, gesturing toward the wagon. "Boss's niece arrived from Boston yesterday. Seems she's staying on while we're gone. Helping her aunt with the house and books, I gather." Thomas frowned. City folk rarely understood the harsh realities of frontier life. They came with romantic notions of the West only to flee back east once winter hit or the first Indian scare rattled them. He had seen it happen too many times. Inside the ranch house, the men gathered in the large dining room where Mr. Samuelson, the ranch owner, waited with his wife. Beside them stood a young woman Thomas had never seen before, tall and slender with honey blonde hair pulled back in a simple but elegant style. Her dress was fine quality but practical, deep blue calico that suggested she understood she wasn't in Boston anymore. She couldn't have been more than 21, with clear green eyes that observed the cowboys with unexpected confidence. "Men, before you head out tomorrow, I want you to meet my niece," Samuelson announced. "This is Miss Faith Beaumont, my sister's daughter. She'll be staying here and helping Mrs. Samuelson with the accounts while I'm traveling with you for the first leg of the drive." Faith Beaumont stepped forward, her posture straight as a pine. "I'm pleased to meet you all," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement, but none of the typical fear or disdain Thomas had come to expect from city women. "I look forward to learning about ranch operations during my stay." Thomas couldn't help but notice the determined set of her jaw. There was something different about her, not just her beauty, which was considerable, but a certain steadiness in her gaze that suggested she wasn't some wilting Eastern flower. "Miss Beaumont's father passed last winter," Mrs. Samuelson added gently. "She'll be with us indefinitely." Thomas felt an unwelcome pang of sympathy. Loss was the one thing everyone on the frontier understood. Still, he reminded himself, it made no difference to him. In a day's time, he'd be on the trail, and in a year, he'd be moving on to the next job, the next territory. City women like Faith Beaumont were temporary fixtures in the Western landscape. Either they returned east or married some shopkeeper in town. They weren't part of his world. If only he had known how wrong he was. The cattle drive departed at dawn the next day, but a broken wagon wheel delayed Thomas and 2 other men. Samuelson instructed them to catch up once repairs were complete, leaving Thomas irritated at the setback. By late afternoon, as he worked on the wheel, a commotion from the barn caught his attention. "Let go," a woman's voice commanded with surprising authority. Thomas rushed toward the sound and found Faith Beaumont backing away from one of the hired hands, Jenkins, a new man with a reputation for trouble. "Come now, city girl," Jenkins was saying, advancing toward her. "Just being friendly-like." Before Thomas could intervene, Faith grabbed a pitchfork from the wall and held it level with Jenkins' chest. "I said step back," she warned, her hands steady on the implement. "My uncle will hear about this." Jenkins laughed. Your uncle's halfway to Kansas by now. But I'm not, Thomas said, stepping into the barn. He kept his voice even as he moved between them. Miss Beaumont, your aunt was looking for you at the house. Jenkins, we need that will fixed if we're going to catch the herd by tomorrow. Jenkins scowled but backed away. Faith lowered the pitchfork but didn't set it down, her knuckles white around the handle. I had the situation under control, she said once Jenkins had gone. I believe you did, Thomas replied, surprised to find he meant it. Most Eastern ladies would have fainted by now. I'm not most ladies. She straightened her skirts with her free hand. And I've dealt with unwelcome advances in Boston. Men like that exist everywhere. Thomas studied her curiously. May I ask what you were doing in the barn alone? Learning, she said simply. If I'm to help with the ranch accounts, I should understand all aspects of the operation. She finally set the pitchfork aside. Thank you for your assistance, Mr. Sutherland. Thomas Sutherland. Well, Mr. Sutherland, I suspect you'll be on your way with the cattle drive soon enough. But I appreciate the intervention nonetheless. We leave once the wagon's fixed. Tomorrow at first light. He tipped his hat and turned to go. Mr. Sutherland, she called after him. Would you be willing to show me how to properly saddle a horse before you leave? My aunt says I should learn, but the stable boy is just 14 and seems terrified of me. The request caught Thomas off guard. Teaching a city woman about horses seemed pointless. She'd never need such skills back east. Yet something in her determined expression made him nod. Meet me here at sundown, he said, immediately wondering why he'd agreed. That evening, Thomas found himself explaining the intricacies of Western saddles to Faith Beaumont as the setting sun cast the barn in golden light. To his surprise, she listened intently, asked intelligent questions, and insisted on trying everything herself. Most ladies prefer side saddles, he commented as she struggled with the weight of the saddle. Most ladies aren't trying to understand ranch operations, she countered, hefting the saddle onto the patient mare with a grunt of effort. Besides, side saddles seem impractical for actual work. And you plan to do actual work? He couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. Faith turned to him, her green eyes flashing. My father lost everything in bad investments before he died, Mr. Sutherland. I came west because I have nowhere else to go. This isn't a holiday for me. It's my future. So yes, I plan to work, to learn, to make myself useful. Thomas felt properly chastised. He'd misjudged her, assuming she was like other Eastern visitors he'd encountered. I apologize, Miss Beaumont. That was uncalled for. Faith, she said, returning to the saddle straps. If you're teaching me to ride like a Westerner, you might as well use my given name. Thomas, he offered in return, though he knew the familiarity was temporary. By morning, he would be gone. Except he wasn't. Just before dawn, a furious thunderstorm struck the ranch. Lightning hit a tree near the remuda, spooking the horses. In the chaos of rounding them up, Thomas's horse stepped in a prairie dog hole, throwing him and leaving the animal with a badly sprained leg. You'll have to stay behind, Samuelson's foreman told him when he returned from the first leg of the drive 3 days later. Boss says you're to help the women until that horse heals, or we can send a replacement from the next town. Could be a few weeks. Thomas was furious at the delay. Weeks at the ranch with nothing but accounting ledgers and a Boston lady for company was not how he'd planned to spend his time. His mood didn't improve when Faith Beaumont approached him the next morning as he was checking his horse's leg. Mr. Sutherland, Thomas, I understand you'll be staying on a while, she said, wearing a simple work dress with her sleeves rolled up. Since you're here, perhaps you could continue my education about ranch operations? My aunt says you've worked all over the territory. Miss Beaumont, with all due respect, I'm a cattleman, not a tutor, he said tersely. And I'm asking you to teach me about cattle, she replied evenly. My uncle left my aunt with little understanding of the business side of ranching. I intend to help her, but I can't do that without knowledge. Thomas sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. One lesson. Tomorrow morning. One lesson became two, then daily excursions around the ranch property. Thomas found himself explaining everything from branding techniques to grazing patterns, surprised by Faith's quick mind and determination to learn. She insisted on riding astride despite her aunt's disapproval, and after a week, she could mount and direct her horse with growing confidence. 2 weeks into his unexpected stay, Thomas was checking fence lines with Faith when dark clouds gathered suddenly on the horizon. We need to get back, he said, eyeing the approaching storm. "We're miles from the house," Faith observed, calculating distances. "The line shack is closer. Over that ridge, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, impressed she had remembered its location from his descriptions of the property. "Can you ride that fast?" Her answer was to spur her horse forward, leaving him to catch up. They reached the small one-room shelter just as the rain began to pound the prairie. Inside was sparse but dry, a small stove, one narrow bed, some basic provisions. Thomas got a fire going while Faith tended to the horses under the attached lean-to. "Could be worse," she said cheerfully as she returned, her hair dampened by the rain. "At least we won't drown or freeze." "Your aunt will be worried," Thomas pointed out, suddenly aware of how improper their situation would appear to others. "Aunt Martha knows I'm with you," Faith said, wringing water from her skirt. "She trusts you." "She shouldn't," Thomas muttered before he could stop himself. Faith looked up sharply. "Are you planning to behave improperly, Mr. Sutherland?" "No, that's not what I meant." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I meant people shouldn't trust me to stay. I don't stay anywhere long. 1 year with this outfit, then I move on. That's my way." Faith sat on a rough wooden chair by the stove. "Why is that your way?" The question was simple, but cut straight through his defenses. In the small shelter with rain drumming on the roof, Thomas found himself speaking about things he normally kept buried: his family's homestead, the raid that took his parents, the years of drifting afterward. "Staying means losing," he concluded. "Everyone I've ever been close to is gone or left behind. The West isn't a place for putting down roots." Faith was quiet for a long moment. "My father always said the same thing about investments," she finally replied. "Never commit too much to one venture." But in the end, it was his constant movement from opportunity to opportunity that cost him everything. She looked directly at Thomas. "Sometimes not committing is the riskier choice." The storm kept them trapped until morning, talking through the night by the stove's glow. Thomas learned about Faith's life in Boston, her father's failed businesses, the gossip and rejection she'd faced as a once wealthy woman suddenly impoverished. "So you see," she said as dawn broke, "I came west not just because I had nowhere else to go, but because I wanted somewhere new to belong, somewhere I could build something lasting." As they rode back to the ranch house, Thomas realized with alarm that in just 3 weeks, Faith Beaumont had become more than a temporary obligation. Her determination, her intelligence, her way of seeing straight through his carefully constructed walls, it unsettled him deeply. When word came that a replacement horse had arrived for him to join the cattle drive, Thomas felt relief mixed with unexpected regret. The morning of his departure, Faith met him at the stables. "I suppose this is goodbye," she said. "Thank you for the lessons." "You're a quick study," he replied, focusing on saddling his new mount. "You'll do fine." "Will you come back with the drive in the fall?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "That's the agreement. Then I'll move on come spring." Faith nodded, as though confirming something to herself. 1 year only. That's your promise to yourself, isn't it?" Thomas looked up, startled by her perception. "It's safer that way." "Safer, perhaps. But is it better?" She handed him his canteen. "Safe journeys, Thomas Sutherland." He rode out that morning with her words echoing in his mind. The cattle drive was familiar work, hard, dangerous, but predictable in its challenges. Yet as weeks passed, Thomas found himself thinking of Promise Creek, of the ranch house, of intelligent green eyes and challenging questions. When an unexpected letter reached him at a supply point, he was shocked to see Faith's neat handwriting. She wrote of the ranch, a drought threatening the western pastures, her aunt's illness and recovery, her own progress in understanding the accounts and discovering discrepancies that suggested someone was skimming money. The letter was practical, informative, not sentimental, yet Thomas read it until the paper grew soft at the creases. He wrote back that night, offering advice about rotating cattle to preserve grass during drought and suggesting she check ledgers from previous years for similar discrepancies. He told himself he was simply helping Samuelson's niece protect the ranch, nothing more. More letters followed at supply points along the trail. Faith's contained news of the ranch, but also observations about the land, questions about cattle markets, and increasingly, small personal details, a new recipe she'd learned, a foal she'd helped deliver, books she was reading by lamplight. Thomas found himself sharing more than just ranching advice in return, writing about the stars over Kansas plains and memories of his mother's songs. He was nearly 2 months into the drive when terrible news reached them. A flash flood had hit Promise Creek, sweeping away part of the ranch and killing 2 workers. The letter, from Samuelson's wife, included a plea. Faith has been working day and night to save what remains of the East pasture. We need experienced hands. Thomas, if you could return, my husband would consider it a personal favor. Thomas stared at the letter, his heart pounding. He should feel reluctance, even resentment at being asked to abandon the drive. Instead, all he felt was urgency, a need to get back to Promise Creek, to see with his own eyes that Faith was safe. Family emergency, he told the trail boss, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He hadn't considered anyone family in 9 years. The journey back to Promise Creek was a blur of hard riding and minimal rest. When he finally crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, his heart sank at the devastation. The creek had overflowed its banks, carving a new path through what had been prime grazing land. The bunkhouse was gone entirely, and part of the barn roof had collapsed. As he approached, he saw a figure on horseback directing workers who were reinforcing what remained of the irrigation system. Even from a distance, he recognized Faith's straight posture and honey-blonde hair, now cropped shorter and tied back with a simple ribbon. She saw him when he was still 50 yards away, her head turning sharply. For a moment, she sat perfectly still on her horse. Then she was galloping toward him, reining in just before their horses would have collided. "Thomas, you came back." Her face was sunburned and tired, but her eyes were bright with surprise. "Your aunt wrote," he explained, suddenly awkward. "Said you needed hands." "We do," she agreed, all business despite the smile she couldn't quite suppress. "The creek's new course threatens what's left of the East pasture. We're trying to divert it back." Thomas nodded, falling instantly into the work rhythm of the ranch. Over the next weeks, he helped Faith implement an ambitious plan to redirect the creek and salvage the damaged pastures. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, too exhausted most nights for more than brief conversations over late suppers. Yet in those fleeting moments, passing tools, sharing canteens, problem-solving over crude maps drawn in the dirt, Thomas felt something he'd avoided for years: connection. Faith had transformed from the Eastern lady he'd first met into a competent rancher who could ride as well as any man, calculate grazing requirements in her head, and negotiate firmly with supply merchants. One evening, a month after his return, Thomas found Faith alone by the repaired barn, staring at account ledgers with a troubled expression. "Something wrong with the numbers?" he asked, setting down the fence posts he'd been carrying. Faith glanced around to ensure they were alone. "I've confirmed what I suspected. Someone's been stealing from the ranch, small amounts over years that add up significantly. And I believe it's Jenkins." Thomas frowned. "The hand who bothered you that first day? He returned with the herd last week." She nodded grimly. "I've found discrepancies that match exactly with supply runs he made to town. But I need proof before I tell my uncle." "How do you plan to get it?" "He's making another supply run tomorrow. I intend to follow him." "Alone?" Thomas couldn't hide his alarm. "Faith, if he's stealing and realizes you're onto him, I'm not afraid of Jenkins," she interrupted. "Well, I am," Thomas admitted. "Not of facing him, but of what might happen to you. I'll go with you." The next day, they followed Jenkins at a discreet distance to town. As Faith had predicted, he made an unscheduled stop at a saloon where they observed him passing money and documents to a well-dressed stranger. "Land deeds," Faith whispered from their vantage point across the street. "He's selling information about vulnerable ranches to land speculators. That man works for the railroad." Thomas's blood ran cold. "We need to tell the sheriff." "Not yet," Faith cautioned. "Look, they're leaving separately. Let's follow the speculator first, see where he goes." They tracked the man to a small office at the edge of town, where Faith boldly approached the window while Thomas kept watch. What she saw made her gasp. "Thomas, there are maps of all the ranches in the valley, including ours. They've marked the properties they plan to acquire, with notes about pressure points for each owner." Her voice dropped. The rocking S is circled in red. Before Thomas could respond, a shout came from down the street. Jenkins had spotted them and was running toward them, hand moving to his gun. "Run!" Thomas pushed Faith toward their horses. What followed was a desperate race back to the ranch, with Jenkins and another man in pursuit. Thomas's horse took a bullet in its flank a mile from the ranch, sending him sprawling into the dirt. As he struggled to his feet, he saw Jenkins approaching, gun drawn. Should have stayed with the herd, Sutherland, Jenkins spat. Miss Beaumont's been poking her nose where it don't belong, and now you're both going to have unfortunate accidents. Thomas tensed, calculating his odds of reaching his own gun before Jenkins could fire, when a rifle shot cracked through the air. Jenkins howled, clutching his arm as his gun fell. Faith sat on her horse 20 yards away, rifle steady in her hands. The next one goes through your heart if you move, she called to Jenkins. Thomas, are you hurt? Just bruised. He managed, retrieving Jenkins's fallen weapon and covering the cursing man. With Jenkins and his accomplice in the sheriff's custody, the full scheme came to light. The railroad had been using inside men like Jenkins to sabotage ranches, creating financial pressures that would force sales at low prices. The flood damage at Promise Creek had been partly their doing, deliberate weakening of creek banks upstream. When Samuelson returned with the remainder of the herd 2 weeks later, he was stunned by both the damage to his ranch and the revelation of the plot against it. If not for you two, he told Thomas and Faith over dinner that night, I might have lost everything. Faith, your father would be proud of the woman you've become. And Thomas, I don't know how to thank you for coming back when you did. Thomas glanced at Faith across the table. I made a promise to be here for a year, he said. I keep my promises. Later that night, he found Faith on the porch, gazing at stars that seemed impossibly bright after the recent trials. A year, she said without looking at him. That was your promise. And then you move on, as always. Thomas leaned against the porch railing. That was the plan. And now, the question hung between them, weighted with all that had transpired. Thomas thought about the man he'd been 3 months ago, convinced that the frontier allowed for nothing permanent, nothing lasting. He thought about the letters they'd exchanged, the battles they'd fought side by side, the way Faith had transformed not just herself but the way he saw the world. Now I'm not so sure, he admitted. Something's changed. Faith turned to him finally, moonlight catching in her eyes. What's changed, Thomas? Everything. He took a step closer. You were right in that line shack during the storm. Not committing is sometimes the riskier choice. I've spent years moving on before I could lose anything, but I never realized how much I was losing by never staying. Faith's expression softened. And now I'm thinking that some things might be worth the risk of staying for. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek. Some people too. I thought you promised yourself. 1 year only, she whispered. I did, Thomas acknowledged. But you made me want forever in less than a month. Everything after that has just been me catching up to what my heart already knew. The months that followed transformed Promise Creek Ranch. With the railroad plot exposed, other ranchers joined forces to protect their land. Thomas took charge of rebuilding, implementing innovations he'd seen in his travels. Faith continued managing the accounts with growing expertise, earning respect throughout the valley. As winter approached, Thomas found Faith in the newly rebuilt barn one evening, checking on a sick calf. Do you remember the first time we met here? He asked. You were holding a pitchfork like you knew how to use it. Faith laughed. I had no idea what I was doing. I was terrified but determined not to show it. That's what I admired from the start, Thomas said, moving closer. Your determination. Your courage. I came west thinking nothing here could last, but you've proven me wrong every day. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. I've been carrying this for weeks, waiting for the right moment. This morning I realized something. On the frontier, there's no guarantee of tomorrow, so the right moment is now. Faith's eyes widened as he opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. Faith Beaumont, I promised myself 1 year at this ranch, but I want to promise you forever instead. Will you marry me? Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. Yes, Thomas. They were married that Christmas in the ranch house, decorated with pine boughs and ribbon. As snow fell gently outside, they exchanged vows before friends, neighbors, and Faith's aunt and uncle. Do you, Thomas Sutherland, take Faith Beaumont to be your lawfully wedded wife? The minister asked. Thomas looked into Faith's eyes, remembering the frightened, lonely man who had arrived at Promise Creek believing that nothing on the frontier could last. I do, he said firmly. For all my days. Spring came to Promise Creek, bringing new grass and calves to the rebuilt pastures. Thomas and Faith stood on the porch of the small house they'd built on the eastern edge of the property, where Samuelson had deeded them land of their own as a wedding gift. "Hard to believe it's been a year since I first came here," Thomas said, his arm around his wife's waist. "I was so certain I'd be moving on by now." Faith leaned against him, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their child grew. And instead, Thomas smiled, taking in their home, their land, and the woman who had changed everything. "Instead, I found the one thing I never thought existed out here, something truly lasting." "What's that?" Faith asked, though the warmth in her eyes suggested she already knew. "Home," Thomas said simply, drawing her closer as the western sun painted the prairie gold. "I found home."